Hello there and welcome to the Weekly Review, a show where we take a closer look at the biggest stories from Hong Kong and around the world. I'm Vijitra Duangdee, coming up on this week's show. Emergency powers and anti-mask law bring Hong Kong's political tension to a new height. Protests show no sign of stopping and the city's leader won't budge. China is extending its censorship claw to more global brands amid Hong Kong's chaos. And a high-profile appeal case by activist and localist Edward Leung. He challenges his prison sentence for rioting and assaulting police during the Mong Kok clashes in 2016. Welcome to our weekly show, Weekly Review. In news making headlines this week, there's a controversial anti-mask law which was introduced under an emergency regulation ordinance. The ban came into effect a week ago, but the impact and public outcry continue. People wearing face masks are still taking to the streets to take a stand against the law. Some of those protests turned into violent clashes. Local politicians and foreign government leaders have also voiced their opposition against the mask ban. Ryan Chang begins our coverage.
Chief Executive Carrie Lam talked up the ban on face masks in her weekly news briefing on Tuesday. She said it's meant to make it clear to people, especially school children, that they can't take part in violent protests and get away with it.
Youngsters shouldn't join these political activities. Even more, these people, students even, shouldn't do violent acts that test the law. One of the main aims of the anti-mask law is to help school principals, parents, teachers and students know that they must not join these activities.
Lam said she was alarmed by the numbers of underaged being arrested in recent protests, and that she expects the new law will take time to have its full effect. Even so, protesters were out in force, wearing masks to take a stand against the controversial ban. Despite the protests showing no sign of stopping, the chief executive said Beijing hopes the city can solve its problems on its own.
Sometimes violence escalates and sometimes it's quiet. We will judge the situation and do what we must accordingly. But for now, we have no plans to use the emergency laws again for any new measures.
The chief executive said she is also disappointed by the lack of tourists over the Golden Week holiday in early October. The number of visitors to the city, usually from the mainland, was down by 50%. Third quarter economic data is also likely to be bad. Ryan Chang, VIEW TV News.
And that defense from Carrie Lam came after a group of 24 pro-democracy lawmakers challenged her use of the emergency powers to bring in the mask ban. The Pan-Dems applied for a judicial review, arguing the government's decision is unconstitutional, and the High Court made in a rare move to fast-track the handling of that application. Diane To explains.
A hopeful tone from pro-democracy lawmakers. They're trying to challenge in court the government's controversial move to invoke emergency powers to bring in the mask ban. The High Court said it was likely to decide in the next 2 weeks whether it would allow a judicial review launched by the 24 legislators.
This is a very rare move by a High Court because obviously I think they also see that this case raises extremely important constitutional issues concerning the use of the power by the chief executive, concerning the role of LegCo as the only lawmaking body in Hong Kong, and whether the chief executive has tried to circumvent LegCo or usurp the function of LegCo in enacting this so-called anti-mask law.
The court, however, threw out the lawmakers' bid for an interim injunction over the mask ban, the second such attempt. The Pan-Dems are arguing that the new law is unconstitutional based on several reasons. They say it's a disproportionate restriction on people's freedoms of expression and assembly, as well as their protection of privacy, pointing out the ban applies to all kinds of public meetings, including protests approved by police. The lawmakers also say there's no evidence showing the police were unable to make arrests and identify suspects before the face-covering law kicked in. They also argued the Emergency Regulation Ordinance, or ERO, is unconstitutional, and as such, the mask ban that was brought in under that law must also be unconstitutional. Their reason for that is they believe the situation in Hong Kong doesn't amount to a public emergency. And they pointed out there's no evidence of the Chief Executive in Council making any attempt at bringing in the legislative branch to scrutinize the bill.
Well, the chief executive is not the only person taking the heat, as the public now sees the Education Bureau as playing a role in fanning the controversy. The EDB issued a notice requiring secondary schools to give a hate count on students who wear masks or take part in class boycotts. Some students criticized the move, saying the policy is spreading fear among young people.
Not letting us wear masks and reporting us to the Education Bureau is a way of punishing us or spreading fear. But we are not afraid and we will keep fighting.
Students have the right to wear masks because diseases like Ebola are quite prevalent. It's quite usual to wear a mask and prevent flu or other diseases from spreading.
And for more on this mask ban controversy, joining us this week to talk is barrister Lawrence Lau. Lawrence has been helping some of the arrested protesters during the recent month's demonstration. Thanks for joining us, Lawrence, here in our weekly review show. Now, as you just heard earlier in our show, pandems have come out and called the emergency law being unconstitutional. That said, do you think they stand a chance in this judicial review?
I do think they do stand a decent chance, and actually I wish them every success because I personally do not want to see such kind of extreme measure to be imposed on every one of us.
Now, you mentioned that they stand a chance, but what if the JR is not granted? Like, what are the possible scenarios that we can expect?
If unfortunately the JR thing will not work, first of all, the law, the anti-mask law would stay for a while. But in the meantime, well, we could still appeal to the higher court. That means the Court of Appeal. And I think this case is of such extreme constitutional importance, it would reach the top level. That means the Court of Final Appeal, the CFA.
Now, also mentioned in the show earlier too that this isn't a rare case. Why do you think this is a rare case for High Court to take this in?
Well, I think according to Dennis' point, he is not saying that it's rare for the High Court to take a case like this. It's rare for the High Court to respond so swiftly and promptly.
Now, on to the mask ban. It seems to be arbitrarily enforced by the police officers. What do you take on that? Is it really
I do agree with your remark. Yeah? I do agree with your remark. And I hope that the police will be more responsible. And actually, in dealing with underage kids, they are so young, inexperienced and vulnerable. The police force should be more restrained and responsible.
But why do you say that it's being enforced kind of arbitrarily? Do you think that the police have not been briefed properly, or the law is vague, or why do you think it's being enforced this way?
I do not have insider source, so I could not tell whether they have been sufficiently briefed or not. But judging from their recent moves, arresting young people on the street or even in the area of the university campus, well, prima facie for just being coached for wearing a mask, I would say it's slightly excessive. Now,
also mentioned in our show, Carol Lam said earlier that this ban, there's been a large number of underage protesters arrested. And what happened to these young people once they get arrested, understanding that you have represented some, is that true?
Yes, but not as young as that.
Okay, not as young as them. Walk us through or explain to us what happened when these young people get arrested.
Certainly, young people like adults, when they are arrested, first of all, they should be promptly to be brought to the police station. And once you are in the custody of the police officers, you will go through a number of procedures. First of all, you will be brought to the attention of the duty officer of the police station to register your presence in their custody. And afterwards, if you are underage, that means under 16, the police convention is to inform their parents, guardians, or someone in the authority position that these young kids are in our custody, so as to inform their family, teachers or guardians that they are in the safe hand. That means the police custody.
Now, what really strikes me is the fact that these anti-mask laws seems to be targeting these young protesters, right? But it just seems like they're not really deterred by this law at all. What is your thought? Like, do you think all these kids prepare to be arrested before they take to the streets? I mean, after you have met or representing some of them?
As I said, these young kids, they are young, inexperienced, and vulnerable. I'm not sure every one of them has well prepared themselves for being coached or fully understand the letters or the provisions of the law. That's something I slightly worry about. So, or if I am the teacher or the guardians or the parents, I would advise them to know more about the law before they go out, to play safe.
Now, what do you foresee happening, after the judicial review? Like, do you think the protesters going to keep happening this way? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think everyone going through this summer would have every difficulty to predict the future. So I'm one of them. I could not predict what would happen because just like last week, people would think once the anti-mask law is in operation, people would be scared, would be staying in. But actually, the reality is just otherwise.
Legally speaking, do you think this law is effective or not?
Well, actually, practically, it's not effective now. People are still going out with their mask on. That means people, I think, decent people, think themselves they do not have a moral reason to comply with this law. And you can see that in people's mind, or is their perception that this law may not be very just.
Do you think is it just because it's not just law, or do you think the law is not actually constitutional or actually has any merit in it? That's why people are not fearing of it.
Of course, I'm on the side of the applicants of the JR. That means I tend to think that this is unconstitutional. At least part of it is unconstitutional. However, our High Court judge may have another view.
Lawrence Lau, thank you very much. We'll have to leave it there. Moving on to other local news, jail localist Edward Leung this week appealed against his 6-year sentence for rioting and assaulting a police officer during the 2016 Mong Kok Lunar New Year clashes. Leung, who was once seen as a divisive figure in Hong Kong's fight for democracy, is now being applauded as having a political vision. Here's Ryan Chang again.
A court hearing that drew a crowd of masked protesters. Hundreds of people turned out in support of Edward Leung's appeal against a 6-year jail sentence, which he's currently serving for rioting and assaulting police. Supporters of the former Hong Kong indigenous spokesman waved banners as he arrived at court with 2 other appellants, Lo Kin Man and Wong Kah Kui, in a correctional services van. In the courtroom, clips were replayed of the violence from February 2016. A government crackdown on unlicensed street hawkers turned into a violent brawl between localists and police. Leung's lawyer says he'll only appeal against his jail term, but not his conviction. Defense counsel Lawrence Lau argued that Leung did not join a premeditated, organized attack that night, as the trial judge determined, and was wearing a mask and helmet for his own protection. Locke also said other protesters in the clashes who engaged in more serious actions like brick throwing and arson got more lenient sentences than Leung. The defense said it was inappropriate for the trial judge to decide that Leung must bear criminal responsibility over rioting incidents that happened later that night. But prosecutor David Leung replied that any defendant charged with rioting wouldn't have their actions looked at in isolation. The court would also consider the level and scale of the violence involved in the whole of the riot. The prosecution also noted that many who participated in the violence that night were wearing Hong Kong indigenous shirts. Edward Leung catapulted to fame and mainstream acceptance after the phrase "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times," which he used in his 2016 election run, was adopted in the anti-extradition protests. It has since been widened into a phrase used by the political movement for universal suffrage.
All right, stay with us. There's plenty more to come on the show when we come back.
I can't even think with the Chinese government censoring everything I write.
China bans American animation sitcom South Park on its latest episode on Chinese censorship. The show creator decides to issue a mock apology. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Well, 4 months of protests haven't given Beijing enough of a headache. Support from the international community might do. China is cracking down on the U.S. National Basketball Association after the Houston Rockets team manager wrote a tweet supporting the pro-democracy movement. Caroline Malone has the story.
What started as a tweet has grown into a business backlash from China and now criticism from US lawmakers. Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey tweeted in support of Hong Kong protests, but later apologised and took the post down. Rockets players were also remorseful.
Yeah, we apologize. We love China. We love, playing there.
The NBA went even further. In a statement in Chinese, it said it was extremely disappointed in Morey's inappropriate remarks. That response drew anger from US lawmakers who slammed the league for buckling under Chinese pressure.
As the country symbolized by the Statue of Liberty, to try to gag a general manager or anybody who is speaking out in favor of the Hong Kong protesters is wrong. It's un-American to gag people when they're speaking out on behalf of freedom.
NBA head Adam Silver has since clarified, saying they support the right of members of the community to freely express themselves, but the Chinese also have a right to react. China is the NBA's largest international market, and the Rockets are one of the most popular teams on the mainland. Fans in Beijing said they were disappointed and saddened by Morey's tweet.
We can no longer watch Rockets matches on TV, and some business have been banned. Rockets fans will undoubtedly be sad, but since this issue involves state security, it can't go unpunished.
And it has been punished. Chinese companies responded quickly to Morey's original tweet, with sportswear brand Li Ning and sponsor Shanghai Pudong Development Bank suspending ties with the Rockets, while Tencent and state broadcaster CCTV dropped the team's games from their sports channels. Caroline Malone for VIEW TV News.
Well, continuing with another Chinese backlash episode, an animated series, South Park seems to have earned itself a ban in China after creators poked fun at their industry's willingness to self-censor and then followed up with a sarcastic apology. Episodes of the show are inaccessible online in China. Matthew Laratonda reports.
I can't even think with the Chinese government censoring everything I write.
The creators of South Park have issued a sorry but not sorry sort of apology to China after an episode critiquing Chinese censorship was reportedly itself censored.
I mean, we live in a time where the only movies that us American kids go see are ones that are approved by China. Yeah, it's like China is the new MPAA.
That episode was originally released on October 2nd, a satire over how Hollywood and other Western businesses have tried to tailor themselves for China's vast consumer market. It also took a dig at China's justice system and Winnie the Pooh. Yes, the cartoon bear is sometimes used by protesters to mock President Xi Jinping, who they claim looks like the bear. Reuters searched Chinese video streaming sites after reports surfaced that the episode was pulled there and couldn't find any copies of the episode that worked. This was the response by South Park's creators. Quote, "Like the NBA, we welcome the Chinese censors into our homes and into our hearts. We too love money more than freedom and democracy." And then, long live the great Communist Party. In other words,
we're trying to break into the market and get the Chinese people as customers.
South Park's creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone are well known for pushing boundaries in their comedies.
First time going to China?
China's Cyberspace Administration, the agency that oversees internet regulations, didn't respond to requests for comment.
Tech giant Apple Inc. is the latest foreign company to be entangled with Chinese diplomacy troubles. It took down an app which Hong Kong protesters have used to track police movements after Beijing's mouthpiece voiced disapproval. Apple said the app, namely HongKongMap.live, was used to ambush police and that violated its company rules, as well as Hong Kong laws. That's after state media People's Daily accused Apple of protecting rioters in the city. It also slammed foreign companies for not understanding the sentiments and way of thinking of Chinese people. And unpopular legislative changes have also brought tens of thousands of demonstrators on the streets in Indonesia, with resulting violence, leaving 2 students dead and more than 500 people arrested. Several thousand students, activists, and workers took to the streets across the country. The protests were triggered by bills being hurried through in the final days of the parliamentary session before a new cabinet is appointed and Joko Widodo gets sworn in for a second term. The bills include an effort to introduce a contentious criminal code that would have effectively served as a legal basis to punish extramarital sex and penalize insulting the president's honor. The latest demonstrations are the biggest student protests since 1998. Elsewhere, Ecuadorian security forces cracked down on protesters in a massive national strike this week as President Lenin Moreno stuck by austerity measures that have triggered the worst unrest in a decade. Michelle Hennessy has more.
Thick clouds of tear gas engulfed Ecuador's capital as protest anger soared across the country. Thousands of demonstrators swarmed the National Assembly on Tuesday, some briefly entering the legislature. Waving flags and chanting, "The people united will never be defeated." A curfew has now been imposed around government buildings, but days of violent protests have already forced the government out of Quito to a coastal town that's seen less trouble. Scenes like this have toppled previous governments in Ecuador, and this is the biggest challenge to President Moreno's 2.5-year rule. The government's decision to cut fuel subsidies last week ignited the unrest led by the country's indigenous community. Moreno has said the measure was necessary to rein in an immense fiscal deficit, inherited from his leftist predecessor, who he accuses of seeking a coup with the help of Venezuela's President Maduro, a claim they both deny. Protesters here are demanding Moreno step down, saying they're urgently seeking a new president. Moreno responded Tuesday night, saying under no circumstance will he resign for making what he called the right decisions for the country. The cuts are part of a multi-billion-dollar loan deal with the International Monetary Fund. And the government has said it's open to mediation from the United Nations or the Catholic Church to quell the worst unrest the country has seen in years.
And that's it for this edition of the Weekly Review. We will be back, of course, next week. I'm Vijitra Duangdee. Until next time, goodbye.
Protesters here are demanding Moreno step down, saying they're urgently seeking a new president. Moreno responded Tuesday night, saying under no circumstance will he resign for making what he called the right decisions for the country. The cuts are part of a multi-billion-dollar loan deal with the International Monetary Fund. And the government has said it's open to mediation from the United Nations or the Catholic Church to quell the worst unrest the country has seen in years.
And that's it for this edition of the Weekly Review. We will be back, of course, next week. I'm Vijitra Duangdee. Until next time, goodbye.